Understanding your happiness or unhappiness is actually a very simple thing. It's all down to the survival instinct and whether you are surviving well or not surviving particularly well. This is an inheritance from our animal origins, and these emotions of happiness, unhappiness, pleasure, pain are animal emotions at the end of the day. And it is possible to some extent, and I guess for a fully, and I hate the word, but a fully enlightened person, maybe they rise above them completely. They still experience those things, but they are not those things. So if we want to look at the opposite of that, then you look at an animal. If you see a lamb leaping around in a field in spring, that lamb isn't saying to itself, "I'm so happy I'm going to leap around." Nothing of the sort. It is just the happiness. It is just the joy of doing that. It's not, doesn't appear to be any part of that lamb that is reflecting on how happy it is. It is the happiness. Similarly, if you see wildebeest starving because the rains haven't appeared, then they will be that pain and they will be that starvation. And there's nothing in them looking on and saying, "Oh, I feel so miserable, I feel so terrible." And this is the thing that animals are spared in actual fact. The awareness of their state. They are the state, one way or the other. And as Gurdjieff says, animals cannot evolve beyond what they are, because they have no reflective capability. Now, a character called Anthony de Mello, who was a Jesuit priest, and was very, very severely criticised by the Vatican. In fact, I think he might have been excommunicated, I'm not quite sure. He said some interesting things. He was an Indian Jesuit priest, so he had that sort of background to him. And he said, life is both wonderful and awful. That's how we as human beings experience it. And when it's wonderful, we're happy. When it's awful, we're definitely unhappy. Because we have, to a lesser or greater extent, some kind of observing consciousness that tells us that we are happy or we are unhappy. And this observing consciousness sort of becomes programmed. We seek things that affirm our life and we avoid things which diminish it. That's okay for animals because animals are those things. There's no observation in there, and in fact animals treat each other as inanimate objects anyway. I happened to see a video yesterday of lions and hyenas eating their prey while the prey was still alive, wildebeest laying down, lions happily munching away at the intestines and so on, and the beast was still alive. To our eyes that is truly foul. And you cannot help but be moved by it when you see that kind of thing. But that is nature. Nature is just one big survival drive in action. If you think about it, that is the only way it can be, because if a species did not have a survival instinct, it wouldn't survive. It would just lay down and say, "Oh, well, I can't really bother to find some food today, it's all too much trouble." And it would become extinct. So those creatures with the strongest survival drive are the ones that actually survive. Now, that life is both wonderful and awful is something we all experience, and I'd like to suggest that we can rise above this duality simply because it causes us so much pain. Of course, we like the pleasure side of it, but we're not at all fond of the pain side of it. Now, we naturally tend to seek pleasure because pleasure is life affirming. Food, shelter, companionship, family, approval, a warm sunny day. If only life could be made of those things and nothing else. All these things are non-threatening, usually anyway. Since our primary animal driver is the desire to survive, and pleasure is nothing but the reinforcement of this drive, we find survival enhancing things pleasurable. It's our programming by nature. and we can't usually escape it. And yet it's a source of all our misery. If we had nothing within us that distinguished between what was enhancing for survival and what was diminishing, we would not know pain. Obviously, think about it. On the other hand, anything that threatens our survival creates pain. Poor health, lack of money, loneliness, disapproval, you name it, lots of things. Again, this is our programming. Nature needs us to seek life-affirming situations because it's in our interest that we survive and breed. Any species that was not driven in this way would obviously not survive and would become extinct, as I've already said. And so the whole dynamic is self-selective. So let's take two extremes of experience. You spend a warm sunny day with a new partner. Have lunch at the best restaurant you've ever been to, just whatever you like. If you're vegetarian, some beautiful vegetarian quiche, or if you like meat, then beautiful steak or lobster, whatever. And afterwards you walk along a long stretch of beach holding hands with the sun setting and all that kind of stuff. And that's a pleasurable side of life because it's all life affirming. Or you visit your doctor and you're told you've got terminal, incurable cancer and you only have a few months to live. Without any doubt, we would all prefer the first circumstance because our programming for survival would be well satisfied. Food for the body, accommodating weather, and a potential mate for reproduction. The second situation is catastrophic for the survival instinct, and so we will feel a huge amount of pain. Now, I could list any number of favourable and unfavourable circumstances that might arise, and we're always gauging them against our survival prospects. So as De Mello suggests, life is both wonderful and awful. And this survival drive colours everything we touch. Beauty is often nothing more than something that is life-affirming. Picture a beautiful lush valley with mountains either side, heavily forested, the birds singing, some brook flowing down the valley. It's all life-affirming. Lots of food, lots of activity, lots of pleasing sounds, because the sound of water is obviously pleasing because we need it for our bodies. This is a life-affirming thing, and it makes us feel good because of that. Whereas a heavily deformed fetus is life-denying. As a result, we see the first is beautiful, the beautiful valley, and the second is ugly. So we already have this duality, what is beautiful and what is ugly. As it says in the Tao Te Ching, once you have said something is beautiful, you've automatically created ugliness. You can't have one without the other. As soon as you start discriminating, you're creating a duality, and that duality will cause you pain. So there's a clue here to living a more balanced and actually happier life. We need to move beyond the duality that the survival instinct creates in us. The survival instinct has a useful role. It keeps us motivated to keep alive. But when we're so heavily identified with it that we cannot step outside of it, then we're just like an animal. We're going to be subject to pleasure and pain on a fairly random basis. So, nothing really is grotesque or sublime in itself. These emotions and judgments simply come about because we judge things from our own survival point of view. Seeing a deformed fetus does not directly affect your survival. It reminds you of death and vastly diminished survival prospects. So instead of running away from the grotesque, can we embrace it? Well, now then, there's an interesting thought, isn't there? To go against nature, to go against our survival programming, to embrace a side of life that we're normally totally in denial of. Such a move would just be so directly against nature. And yet if we want peace and joy, this is the way we have to go. It's what I've mentioned in other videos. It's called mirror work. If you want one thing, you have to go for the opposite. That's the way it works in spiritual work. Very often works in life as well. In my own situation, I ended up in a job where I got considerable profile. I hated it. And yet I had someone who was an ex-business partner who clamours for fame, and he just could not get it. And as a result of that, he hated me. Just totally hated me because I got what he wanted. I've talked about envy in other videos, but that was a very good example. So I've no doubt that this idea of embracing the grotesque and the ugly will have no appeal to most people. And as a result, they'll just continue to live like animals because they will be forever naturally attracted towards the pleasurable and in total denial about the unpleasurable and the ugly. But the considerable effort that is required to achieve a balance between these two things is a lot of work, and you wouldn't expect peace and joy to come really at a lower price than that. The philosopher Spinoza had something to say about this. In the appendix to part 1 of his masterwork, The Ethics, he says, "Why are there so many imperfections in nature?" And we all ask ourselves this question. "Such, for instance, as things corrupt to the point of putridity, loathsome deformity, confusion, evil, sin, etc. But these reasons are, as I have said, easily confuted. For the perfection of things is to be reckoned only from their own nature and power. Things are not more or less perfect, according as they delight or offend the human senses, or according as they are serviceable or repugnant to mankind. And there is the essence of the whole situation." I'll just repeat that last sentence. Things are not more or less perfect, according as they delight or offend human senses, or according as they are serviceable or repugnant to mankind. So what he's saying is, things are as they are in themselves, and they have their own perfection, because when we judge things, we judge them against some standard. We're making a comparison. And yet everything, in its own right, is perfect if there's no one there to judge it. But we do judge it according as things delight or offend us. In other words, as they reinforce our sense of survival or diminish our sense of survival. There's a wonderful scene in the movie American Beauty where Ricky Fitz, actually called Mental Boy by one of the other characters, is videoing the body of a dead bird lying in the grass. Someone asks him why he would do that, and he responds that he is videoing it because it is beautiful. He happens to be the only sane character in the whole movie. All the other characters are living in deep denial. For him, the grotesque and the sublime are no longer distinguishable. And I guess in some traditions he would be called enlightened. Although that's a term I really don't like because it's just so heavily misused. Many spiritual practices today are neurotically centered on the pleasant and beautiful. If you see some of the modern day gurus, it's in some beautiful building with a nice a vase of flowers in full bloom, and they sit there in their modest but very attractive clothes and talk about whatever it is they talk about. But this is neurotic because it's totally denying the other side of life. When deformity and ugliness come into the lives of people who follow these practices, they're even less capable of dealing with it, and as such become deniers of life's reality. And this creates a deep neurosis, which in turn creates very, very great unhappiness. What this means in practice is that we need to start bringing the chaotic and deformed into our life. Who on earth would do that? It's going to happen to you anyway. If you've ever lost someone and seen their body after they've died, you will know the shock of seeing something that was once alive and is now basically a cold stone figure, no life in it whatsoever. So the deformed and the ugly will be with you anyway. So to balance this driver that we have, we need to embrace the whole of life. And actually what it does is it diminishes the power of this tyrant within us that would have us only chase after the beautiful and the life-enhancing. Gurdjieff, a 20th century spiritual teacher, recommended that we contemplate our own death as often and with as much intensity as we can. How many people are going to do that? Not many. In fact, I remember, and you probably know if you've seen other videos, I've been very deeply involved with the Gurdjieff work. In one of the groups that we went to, I say we, both myself and my wife, there was a session where the guy who was leading the group talked about all the horrors, just unspeakable horrors that can happen in life. It so upset my wife that she basically ran out the room and went to the toilet and threw up. She was so upset by it. But this was not unusual, because we need to be able to handle both sides of life, otherwise we're just in some neurotic denial, and that causes unhappiness. To actively go seeking the grotesque and the ugly is a liberating thing. And yet, how many of the modern day so-called spiritual gurus are talking about this? No, they're pandering to your need for survival by only talking about the beautiful, the good, the attractive, the reinforcing, and it creates an imbalance. But we should also allow the so-called beautiful and pleasant to come into our life. You know, we actually don't need to work at that. It's going to happen anyway. So we don't just focus on the grotesque, the ugly, the foul. We also look at the beautiful and the good and so on. And what happens is you see that they are both imposters. They're both meaningless, as far as a human being is concerned, a real human being. You know, in the end, we need to be able to play with all of this. And I'm not using the word play in a trivial sense. I'm meaning to be able to consciously move between what traditionally is called the grotesque and what is traditionally called the beautiful and the good. To be able to play with them with equal feeling towards both of them, and knowing that both of them are imposters. They're not real. They're just the results of circumstances, of fortune. To play with beauty and the ugly simply means that we have seen that they are both irrelevant in a sense. We've simply created our own biased perspectives based on what is affirming for us or what is diminishing. For those who feel we can rise above the unpleasant but keep the pleasant, which is what most spiritual teachings are about, you know, the unpleasant and the ugly are, how can I put it, they're seen as a lower form of life, or whatever term you want to use. For those who feel that we can just rise above the unpleasant and move into some perfect, flowered, multicoloured universe where everything is pleasant, are in for a big disappointment. It's not like that. It's not going to happen. And if that's what you want, then you should just sign up for any of the hundreds of spiritual schools that promise some form of unending happiness. The reality, however, is that you will end up with some form of unending neurosis.